The untold history of Israel, Abraham's legacy, and the divided kingdom. Imagine a single promise spoken beside the dust of an ancient road, a vow that would echo across deserts, through palace corridors, and into the prayers of generations yet unborn. That promise began with a call. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, to the land I will show you. In that command, heard in the twilight of Ur's clay-brick streets, a covenant was planted. Land for a people, descendants for a promise, blessing for the world. Centuries will pass, and the names will change. Abram becomes Abraham, Jacob becomes Israel. But the threads remain. They are the invisible cords that bind disparate episodes into one long, fragile tapestry. Covenant, testing, failure, mercy. They trace how a family called to embody a sacred pledge becomes nation, and then a kingdom split by human choices. This is the story not merely of kings and battles, but of promises that outlast fear, betrayals that fail to extinguish hope, and a legacy that presses toward a future beyond itself. When the story begins, Ur is a city of bustle and starlit canals, where clay-smelling ovens and the calls of merchants fill the air. Abram is a figure among many, a man whose life will bend the arc of history because he obeys a voice that asks him to step into uncertainty. The road from Ur is both literal and symbolic. Departure from familiar gods, leaving wealth and security, trusting a direction that cannot be surveyed on any map. It is a test of faith, whose language will be spoken over and over in the ages to come. Faith as movement, faith as risk. God's promise to Abram is plain yet astonishing in scope. A land to inhabit, a people to become, and a blessing that will reach beyond his own household. The promise contains both intimacy, descendants who will carry his name, and breadth, a blessing that touches nations. Abraham's life is marked by recurring moments that reveal the promise's stubborn persistence and the human weakness it must endure. There are nights of laughter and sorrow. Sarah, long barren, is promised a son. The joy of Isaac's birth is shadowed by doubts and desperate choices. When Sarah offers Hagar to Abraham, an attempt is made to advance God's promise by human design. The result is a shadow line. Ishmael is born, and with him the ripple effects of decisions made in haste rather than in waiting. Yet even this tangled episode does not cancel the original word. Rather, it complicates the path of the promise and prepares the ground for lessons about trust and timing. The most wrenching test of all comes when Abraham is asked to offer Isaac, the child of promise, on the altars of obedience. The hilltop scene, where a father lifts a knife and a hand is stopped by an unseen command, presses at the heart of what covenant faith demands. The story resists any easy moralism. It is not a tale of violence for its own sake, but of trust stretched to breaking. It is a paradox in which fidelity and the horror of the demand converge. When the Lord provides a ram in place of the son, the narrative frames God as both the one who asks and the one who sustains, drawing a line between testing and ultimate mercy. Here the promise is not annulled. It is sealed in the character of a God who calls for faith and then accompanies those who answer. From Abraham, the line continues. Isaac grows, marries Rebekah, and fathers twins whose rivalry marks the next turn in the covenantal drama. Jacob, the quieter, cunning son, wrestles his way into the birthright and blessing. He flees into the wilderness, into the household of Laban, where he serves and marries and becomes the instrument of further twists in God's plan. Rachel and Leah, their unspoken griefs, their small triumphs, populate the domestic theatre where God's promise is lived awkwardly, imperfectly. Jacob's night of wrestling is a watershed. Facing an unnamed adversary, a man, an angel, a presence he cannot fully name, he clings until dawn. The struggle leaves him wounded and blessed. A new name is given, Israel, one who wrestles with God and men and yet prevails. The name itself becomes a covenantal identity, a people who have known struggle, who carry scars and testimonies, who will carry forward the ambiguous legacy of human striving under divine promise. These are family stories, and they are intimate, yet they are not private. In Jacob's household, favoritism and sibling hate sow disaster. Joseph, beloved son, arrives at the center of a domestic storm. His dreams, bold, symbolic, impossible, fan jealousy into fury. When his brothers strip him of garments and sell him into slavery, Joseph leaves Canaan not only physically abroad, but morally shattered. He is taken to Egypt, that vast and strange world at the edge of the Mediterranean world, and his fate seems sealed. But the theme that threads through the patriarchal narratives is providence, a God who can turn human malice into survival. In Egypt, time and narrative bend. Joseph is elevated from prisoner to prime minister, not by chance, but by a pattern that the story insists on calling providence. His skill in interpreting dreams, messages that the living cannot control, places him in the court of Pharaoh. When dreams foretell famine, Joseph's wisdom becomes the instrument of survival, not only for his captors, but for his own family. The betrayal that once seemed like a final severing is rewoven into the means of preservation. The reunion in Goshen is a scene of high drama and even higher irony. The very land where a boy was sold as a slave now becomes a refuge for his kin. Jacob's migration to Egypt, an event that would later be remembered with mixed feelings, is at first a triumph of providence. Lives are saved, heritage is preserved, a people gathers in one place under the shadow of a foreign throne. The promise that began with a single man on the road from Ur appears to have widened its scope. Descendants survive famine because a younger son rises in a foreign land. Yet the narrative is careful to keep a sober voice amid the relief. The moves that secure survival are not the same as wresting sovereign claim to territory. The promise of land, the sacred geography promised to Abraham, remains unsettled. Egypt is relief, not fulfillment. It shelters the family, but does not substitute for the covenantal ground promised in Canaan. There is a tension here that will haunt the story: blessing and exile, provision and displacement. From the outset, the promise is both fulfilled and deferred. God's hand secures the people in stages that teach dependence and patience. The patriarchal epoch is not a triumphal procession of flawless heroes. Abraham and Jacob, Sarah and Rachel, Joseph and their companions are all flawed and yet chosen instruments. Their lives teach that divine purposes are often advanced through human weakness, and that God's faithfulness is not a reflection of human merit, but of divine resolve. The covenant holds through missteps and violence, through schemes and mercies. It holds because the promise was not given lightly, and because the God who gives it is determined to see it through. When Jacob dies in Egypt, he does not bury his descendants permanently in the soil that had nurtured his ancestors. He makes his sons promise that his bones will be carried back to Canaan when the time comes. A vivid affirmation that Egypt is provisional. Joseph buries his father in the land of promise, and his own deathbed includes a pledge: "Do not leave my bones in Egypt when you go home." These funeral acts are not mere sentiment, they are prophetic gestures. They preserve memory and point forward, insisting that the dream of a homeland cannot be fully satisfied in the courts of Pharaoh. Time moves on. The family grows into a multitude. The text records that those who once benefited from royal favor become a people numerically significant, a presence that will be difficult to ignore. The Egyptian hospitality that once saved them will sour into suspicion. New dynasties and new policies alter the political climate. A memory that began with gratitude turns into a fear that the foreigners might claim identity or cause trouble. Power forgets its debt. And then comes the hard turn. The place that sheltered Israel becomes the place of their bondage. The narrative makes the shift with stark language. The people are oppressed, their lives made bitter in hard labor, their cry rising up to heaven. The very country that once bowed to a foreigner's wisdom now sees those descendants as a threat. Pharaoh's policy is not simply political. It seeks to undo the future promised to Abraham by crushing the potential of his offspring. Midwives are commanded to destroy male infants. Human dignity is subordinated to an imperial calculus. This oppression presses the covenant into a new phase. If the promise to Abraham included land and descendants, that promise now seems endangered. The story intensifies what it means to be a people chosen. To be chosen is not to be insulated from pain, but to be positioned in history, where God's purposes will be tested and ultimately revealed. Under the weight of violent subjugation, Israel's identity hardens, memory becomes rescue. The prayers of those who suffer reach upward, and their groans are heard. From this crucible emerges a deliverer whose name alone will bend mountains of tradition, Moses. The narrative introduces him in startling fashion, a child placed in a basket among the reeds of the Nile, a fragile life set against the relentless current of politics. He is found by one who should be an enemy, and is raised in the house of Pharaoh, a Hebrew raised as an Egyptian prince. The irony is thick. The future liberator is formed within the power structure that seeks his people's annihilation. The plot seems full of paradox, and yet the pattern repeats. God chooses unexpected vessels, shapes destinies in ways that surprise human expectations. Moses' calling is both dramatic and intimate. In the wilderness, at a bush that burns without being consumed, the voice of God calls him to name and to task. I am who I am. The text gives a phrase that resists easy paraphrase. It speaks to the depth of the divine character rather than to a neat doctrinal formula. Moses learns that he will be the instrument of a people's emergence, but he also learns his own weakness. He protests, he argues, he fears the burden of leadership. The scene offers one of the narrative's consistent motifs. Leaders are chosen not because of their confidence, but often despite their doubts. God's work is not contingent on human perfection. The confrontation with Pharaoh becomes a theological drama. Plagues, signs that pierce the authority of Egyptian gods and unsettle the cosmic order, unfold as a series of argumentative encounters between a stubborn ruler and a persistent divine will. Each plaguing phenomenon, water turned to blood, darkness that can be felt, the death of the firstborn, communicates a reality. Sovereignty belongs to the one who called the people into being. Yet even as wonder operates in public spectacle, the narrative refuses to make it a mere spectacle. Each sign carries meaning. Each liberation is tethered to covenant language. The Passover is born out of this contest, an act of remembrance and identity that will shape Israel's calendar and consciousness forever. It is a ritual of passing over, of marking households that will be spared from death, an act that fuses deliverance with covenant identity. When the sea parts and the people walk through on dry ground, the imagery is cinematic for a reason. It is a theophany, God acting into history in a way that alters the course of a people. Yet the text also wants the reader to know that the journey is not the end, but the beginning. Freedom gives birth to law. The newly freed gather at Sinai, and there the covenant matures. The divine word is given with thunder and smoke. A community learns that liberation alone does not create holiness. Law becomes the structure within which the promise is guarded and cultivated. The tabernacle will later become a portable sign that God moves with the people, holiness made mobile. Even there, in the heart of Revelation, human frailty reveals itself. The golden calf is the scandal that follows the giving of the law. People fashion for themselves an image to bridge the divine distance, and their worship collapses into imitation. The memory of deliverance, rather than producing gratitude, yields anxiety that leads back to idolatry. The sin is serious, and the narrative does not minimize it. Yet even in the moment of greatest failure, a pattern appears. Judgment is real and stern, but mercy is not exhausted. Covenant language persists. The people are not abandoned to their worst impulses. The wilderness years are a long conversation between promise and practice. Manna falls, water springs from rock, serpents are turned into signs of healing when bronze is lifted on a pole. These episodes are not mere wonders to entertain. They are pedagogical tools. They teach dependence, remind a wandering people that sustenance comes not exclusively from human labor, but from a sustaining providence. They also prefigure themes that will later be read theologically: the necessity of trust, the danger of complaint, the way God's provision both answers and tests faith. Time in the desert shapes the character of Israel. It forges a communal identity around memory and law, around ritual and story. When at last the people cross into the land under Joshua's leadership, there are stones set up at Gilgal to remember what God has done. Victory, the narrative insists, is not merely the result of military genius, but the outcome of obedience and divine presence. Jericho's walls fall, Shiloh's assembly grows, the promise moves from nomadic hope to territorial reality. God's presence is symbolically housed. The tabernacle takes shape, and the dream of a stable, cultivated life in promised soil begins to be lived. Yet even amid conquest and settlement, the recurring strain is audible. Fleeting faith, stubborn sin, the cyclical pattern of apostasy and return. The period of the Judges exposes the fragility of national fidelity. Leaders arise in punctuated moments of deliverance, Deborah, Gideon, Samson among them, but they do not create sustainable holiness. The people fall back into idolatry and injustice, cry out, and are rescued again. This cycle becomes a narrative warning. The pattern of sin and reprieve is costly and warns of the deeper need for stable leadership and covenantal heart change. The call for kings emerges from this weariness. Samuel, last judge and prophet, hears the demand of the people: "Give us a king like the nations." It is a plea born of insecurity, born of desire for visible stability. The text notes that the request is both political and spiritual. A monarchy will centralize authority and bring new forms of identity, but it will also shift Israel's trust outward from the God who had been their king in a different mode. The transition to monarchy is thus a hinge. It will yield both momentary victories and profound moral tests. Saul becomes the first king, anointed with public fanfare but marked by failure. His rise and fall prepare the stage for David, a shepherd and harpist, a man both of heroic faith and tragic weakness. David's ascent is full of cinematic episodes: the slayer of the giant, the beloved of the people, the king who wins victories and whose heart is tender to the Lord. Yet his story is not hagiography. His sin with Bathsheba, the orchestrated death of Uriah, and the prophet Nathan's piercing word reveal the cost of power misused. David's repentance is genuine and painful. His psalmic laments and pleas reshape the theology of sin and forgiveness. From his house comes a promise that is both political and theological, that his line will endure, that his throne will be an axis of hope. The Davidic covenant becomes the theological hinge through which messianic expectation will later pivot. Solomon's reign is the height of the united monarchy's splendor. Wisdom, wealth, and the building of the temple in Jerusalem present a crescendo of national aspiration. The sacral center is fixed, the ark is housed, incense perfumed the courts. The temple's gold and cedar stand as tangible testimony to a people who imagine themselves established. Yet the story refuses to let glory be naive. Solomon's later years are marred by the problem that often follows power. He accumulates foreign wives, allows syncretistic practices, and his heart is turned in ways that erode the purity of worship. The splendor of a temple cannot itself guarantee fidelity. And then the fracture comes. The moment of division is at once political and spiritual. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, makes choices that stoke old resentments. He fails to lighten the burdens that had stoked popular discontent. Jeroboam, a northern leader, responds by creating an alternative worship system, golden calves to rival the temple's cult, institutionalizing what had begun as fear of losing a national identity. The narratives present the split as more than a palace quarrel. It is the crystallization of years of moral drift, of a leadership that misreads the seeds of devotion and sets up substitutes that mimic the form of worship while hollowing its substance. The result is a divided kingdom, North and South, Israel and Judah, political reality mirroring spiritual fracture. The northern kingdom institutionalizes idolatry and earns harsh words from the prophetic voices. The southern kingdom struggles with its own compromises and periodic reformations. Prophets rise as the conscience of a nation, calling for return, warning of judgment, yet always holding out a thread of hope about restoration. Even in judgment, the prophets point ahead to a future in which the promises to Abraham and David find deeper and fuller expression. This is the larger arc we are tracing, from a single call at the edge of Mesopotamia to a kingdom cleft by human choice. Abraham's legacy threads through every stage, a promise that binds the family into a people and binds that people into a narrative of God's persistence. The divided kingdom, then, is not simply a late chapter in history. It is the climax of a long moral and theological drama. It shows how promises can be preserved despite failure, and how the loss of covenantal fidelity leads not merely to political fracture, but to spiritual exile. If the patriarchs teach us about beginnings, providence, and the stubborn preservation of God's purpose, then Joseph's story offers a decisive demonstration of how apparent catastrophe can be reworked into salvation. Yet even Joseph's triumph contains the seed of the next catastrophe. The very relocation that ensures survival plants the roots of a future bondage. Egypt's hospitality will become oppression, a palace favor will sour into suspicion. The divine plan works through human contingencies, and those contingencies carry the risk of reversal. But before that reversal can be narrated, the family grows and prospers. Joseph's wisdom secures grain in times of famine. Entire clans find sustenance. The house of Israel multiplies in a land not their own. The dream of a people who will outlast famine seems plausible. Yet the narrative already hints at what will come. Power shifts, new rulers forget former kindnesses, and the calculus of empire turns. The soil that sheltered the ancestors becomes soil that oppresses the descendants. It is at this pivot between provision and oppression, between savior and tyrant, that the story pauses, heavy with irony and foreboding. The same God who guided Abram across uncertain roads now prepares to pluck an oppressed people from the clutches of imperial power. The instruments God will use are unlikely: a man in a basket, a voice from a burning bush, a staff raised over the sea. But those come later in the telling. For now, the promise continues to pulse through the hearts of a people who remember a road from Ur, a ram on a hillside, a ladder to heaven, and a man who dreamed himself into leadership. Centuries of memory condensed into family names, rituals, and the promise carved into bones, carried back to Canaan. The covenant insistently reminds them that they are not rootless wanderers. They are heirs of a word that demands both allegiance and patience, and yet the human story continues to lurch between fidelity and failure, between obedience and innovation that betrays the core of what was entrusted. But the narrative does not leave us in the dark. Even as history leans toward a new season of suffering, the same covenantal current that began with Abraham persists. God's promise is not derailed by kings' follies or by the fickleness of human devotion. It moves forward in ways that surprise and discomfort, that test and teach. The work of salvation will continue to unfold in forms both grand and humble, in courts and deserts, in palaces and shepherd tents. Yet here the tale pauses, poised at the threshold. The descendants are numerous, their bones rest in Canaan, their lives are prospering in Egypt, but the breeze has shifted and with it the political winds. The scene is set for a new chapter, a rising oppression, a child placed among reeds, and a God who will call out of burning thorn. The legacy of Abraham will be tested anew, and the unfolding drama will ask whether the promise itself can withstand the forces that would crush a people. If you love deep dives into Bible legends, subscribe for more. The immediate horizon holds images that have traveled into countless retellings: midwives defying a king, a child hidden among papyrus, a mother's courage bleeding into divine rescue. Yet these images are not merely picturesque, they are theological fulcrums. They hinge on decisions of rulers who fear, of parents who trust, of strangers who show mercy. They are small human acts that intersect with a larger divine economy. Moses' early years are framed by a tension between identity and upbringing. Raised in royal halls, he is nonetheless marked by the breath of his people. When he perceives the injustice inflicted on one of his kin and responds with violence, his impulsive act reveals a man who cannot be wholly shaped by privilege. Exile to Midian follows, and in the wilderness Moses learns humility and patience. There, tending flocks, he becomes a man-student of silence, shaped by years that will prepare him for speaking a word that has the weight of nations. The burning bush sequence is as much about naming as about commissioning. It redraws the contours of divine identity. I am the one who is, and it frames the mission to be undertaken. Moses is given signs, assurances, and reluctantly accepts a burden that will be more than his own. Gifts of speech are promised, but not without acknowledgement of human fragility. The story insists repeatedly that God's purposes are not thwarted by human inadequacy. Rather, God equips and accompanies those called. When Moses returns to confront Pharaoh, the stage is set for a contest not merely of power, but of truth. Each confrontation strips away illusions of divine supremacy long held in the Egyptian order. Plagues peel back layers of confidence and reveal a God who will not be ignored. Yet the text refuses to make this theater only about spectacle. Throughout the narrative stresses purpose: to free a people, to form them into a nation, to bring them to a place where covenant can be renewed and deepened. Deliverance in this telling is always oriented toward relationship. The Passover, then, becomes more than an event. It becomes identity-making. The mark on the doorframes, the lamb's blood, the shared meal, these become memory acts, a liturgical way of recounting deliverance for every household. From that night, Israel will recount itself to itself as a people whom God passed over, a people whose history is carved by rescue. The rhythm of remembering will become a central feature of their life. The story will be told and retold until the narrative itself forms the community. As the sea rolls back and the people walk to the other shore, a new chorus emerges. Praise and fear blending into a dawning recognition of who has acted in history. But even as sanctification deepens, the community's capacity for faith-walking remains fragile. Laws must be learned, sanctity practiced, and the people must learn that being chosen demands a distinct way of life. When the people gather at Sinai and the covenant language is expanded into law and ritual, the theological architecture of Israel takes shape. The tabernacle is the outward sign of an inner reality. God dwells among a people who shape themselves by commandments that protect justice, mercy, and holiness. The law is not merely constraint, it is a way to embody the character of the one who called them. The tension of human longing and divine holiness will be a running theme. The law aims to shape hearts toward a fidelity that often eludes them. Even within that formative period, the golden calf scandal exposes how quickly identity can fracture into a counterfeit. The people's impatience leads to an imitation of worship that mirrors surrounding cultures without possessing their meaning. The punishment is real, the mercy remaining is equally firm. The story will not let us forget. Sinai is a place of revelation and of testing. Both are necessary for a people learning to live under the rule of a holy God. As the wilderness generation prepares to enter the land, Joshua's leadership will translate following into conquest. Memorial stones will be set, and the idea will emerge that victories are not merely military triumphs, but signs of divine favor in response to trust and obedience. The narrative emphasizes that God's presence is the decisive factor, that the ethic of dependence continues to shape outcomes. Yet the conquest itself is uneven and partial, leaving pockets of resistance and a landscape of moral ambiguity. Settlement does not erase the need for fidelity. Rather, it multiplies opportunities for compromise. The period of the Judges then reveals the cyclical nature of a people trying to live in covenant without settled hearts. The Judges deliver, the people celebrate, yet the cycle repeats. The nation's cry for kingship emerges out of fatigue, a desire for predictability and unity. The elders ask for a king, and the narrative voice records a sober note. In wanting to be like other nations, Israel risks losing the particular character of its call. Saul's appointment as the first king is therefore ambivalent. His initial promise degenerates into disobedience and ruin. David's rise, however, reshapes expectations. He is the man according to the narrative's heart, a man whose failures are raw and whose repentance is recorded with painful honesty. His psalms give voice to the inner life of a nation that knows both triumph and disgrace. David's covenantal promise that his seed will endure becomes the theological thread that binds past and future. It is a promise that will be invoked by prophets and poets and that will shape messianic longing. Solomon's glory is a high point. The temple is built, and in its consequent rituals the people glimpse the possibility of a stable center for worship. The temple's dedication is an act of liturgical grandeur, a moment where heaven and earth seem to touch. Yet Solomon's descent into compromise shows how quickly spiritual center can be eroded by personal folly. The glory fades into neglect, and the seeds of division sprout. When the kingdom divides, the political and spiritual fractures become explicitly intertwined. Jeroboam's erecting of calf images is a political maneuver to secure loyalty, and it has devastating theological consequences. Worship becomes a tool for political consolidation rather than a response to divine revelation. The prophets will denounce such moves with searing clarity, calling for repentance and restoration. But the prophets also carry the promise forward. Even as judgment is proclaimed, restoration is promised in mysterious terms. Abraham's legacy is thus a double-edged instrument. It is source of hope and also a standard against which deviation is judged. The divided kingdom will stand as a human attempt to reconfigure identity without the core of covenant fidelity, and the prophetic hope will insist that the promises made to Abraham and David are not nullified by human failure. They are, in the prophetic imagination, seeds that will germinate into a future that surpasses present corruption. And yet, for the moment, the story pauses at the door of a land of bondage. Egypt's prosperity shelters the first generations. Its power will later attempt to smother their future. The scene is set for dramatic reversal, from palace favor to oppression, from survival to slavery, from promise kept in part to promise challenged. At this hinge, the narrative gathers its breath, and a new voice prepares to emerge, a prophet, a deliverer, a lawgiver, whose life will again test the endurance of Abraham's legacy. The untold history of Israel continues to press toward that moment, where covenant will be hardened in fire and promise will be forged into nationhood. The path from a starry call in to a people trembling before an imperial decree is long and fraught. Yet throughout it one reality remains. The promise persists. It moves, it survives, it haunts the story like a melody that will not be silenced. The wind that carried the memory of a starlit call in now shifts toward the sea. A people, grown numerous and gripped by a foreign hand, find their cry answered in a way that redraws history. Moses, once a child of the reeds and then a stranger in Midian, returns as the bearer of an impossible vocation. His life binds together the unlikely instruments that God uses: a hesitant voice, a stuttering spokesman, a shepherd's patience, and a divine presence that will not be contained by palace walls. The plagues unfold as a series of moral and cosmic reckonings. Each calamity peels back a layer of the world's assumed order. Waters turn to blood, frogs and insects asserting chaos on human assumptions, darkness that presses like a hand against the land. Finally, the rupture that strikes a mother's heart, the death of firstborn sons. These signs are not merely punitive displays, they are declarative acts that expose pretensions of power and demand a response from a people who are learning what it means to be claimed and protected. In the tension between terror and deliverance, a new ritual is born. The Passover meal, simple, urgent, marked by the sheltering sign on doors, will become the community's memory-made liturgy, a night when judgment passed and mercy held fast. When the sea parts and the people step onto dry ground with walls of water on either side, the moment becomes the centerpiece of a national identity. It is a theophany that presses upon memory with sacred force. The song that rises after the shore is crossed is both praise and pedagogy, an attempt to name what God has done so that fear may be shaped into faithful response. Yet the narrative is careful. Deliverance is not the final chapter. It is a new beginning that requires formation. At Sinai, the people receive a framework to live within. The mountain trembles with voice and smoke. The law is given not as mere legislation, but as a way of life intended to make a people holy. The tabernacle, later raised as a movable shrine, will serve as the portable promise that God moves with them. Worship becomes a humble theater in which the divine and human meet. But holiness is not a simple matter of codes. It is a transformation of craving and loyalty. Even here, the fragile heart of the community betrays itself. In a rush of impatience and fear, when leadership is delayed and anxiety blurs faith, an idol is fashioned, and the golden calf becomes the tragic emblem of how trust can be replaced by imitation. The scandal at Sinai teaches a brutal lesson. Revelation does not eliminate sin. It exposes it. The wilderness years are long instruction. Bread from heaven falls in the morning, water blooms from barren rock, serpents bite, and a bronze image lifted on a pole becomes the strange medicine for healing. These episodes are pedagogical, designed to teach dependence, patience, and the cost of complaint. The generation that refuses to trust the journey will not enter the land. The promise advances, but the path is purged of stubborn unbelief. From the deathbed of this wandering cohort, another generation prepares to step into inheritance under Joshua's command. Conquest under Joshua translates memory into territory. Stones set up at Gilgal, newly crossed thresholds, and the dramatic fall of Jericho become theological statements. Victory is not merely the fruit of arms, but the fruit of obedience and divine presence. Yet the conquest is neither total nor unambiguous. Cities remain unconquered, peoples remain in the land. The moral texture of settlement is complicated by compromise. The covenantal ethic demands that the people live differently in the land they receive, but human hearts remain prone to old patterns. The promised soil is a gift and a test. The era of the judges reveals the cost of unsettled hearts. Without a centered covenantal fidelity, the people relapse into cycles: apostasy, oppression, lament, and deliverance. Figures like Deborah, who rises as a striking counterpoint to the era's chaos, or Gideon, called from hiding to lead with uneven courage, or Samson, whose raw strength is matched by personal recklessness. Each judge offers a momentary reprieve but not a lasting institution. Their stories carry both heroism and pathos. They show how God raises deliverers from broken people, and how such rescue is not a substitute for a heart reformed. The refrain repeats: when the people cling to old patterns, disaster returns. When they cry out in truth, mercy responds. Wearied by this circular motion, Israel demands what the nations have: a king. The plea for a monarch is born of anxiety and desire for stability. Samuel, the closing judge and a prophet, warns that a human king will bring taxes and conscription, and yet the people persist. Saul is anointed amid hope and expectation. He begins with promise, but slides into disobedience, his throne slipping as his will diverges from the word. His failure sets the stage for a more complicated hero. David emerges not as an aristocrat, but as a shepherd, a man whose heart the narrative treats with raw sympathy. The story of a tall boy swinging a sling at a giant, of songs composed in tents, and of victories won both in battle and in the inner life, creates a portrait of a king whose charisma unites a people. Yet David's life also bears the gravity of scandal. His desire for Bathsheba, the arranged death of Uriah, and the prophet's rebuke, that piercing question that exposes the kingdom to its moral core, reveal that even a man after God's own heart is capable of deep sin. David's lament and repentance are recorded with painful candor. His psalms give voice to a soul that has seen both grace and judgment. From him comes a promise that is more than political, an assurance that his house and throne will endure in ways that point beyond his own mortal reign. The Davidic promise will become the theological anchor of later longing. Solomon, David's son, brings the united monarchy to its pinnacle. Wisdom tales and judgments, caravans and palaces, and the crowning achievement of the temple in Jerusalem shape an age of splendor. The temple, with its cedar and gold, becomes the central sanctuary, the place where heaven and earth seem to touch in liturgical rhythm. Yet splendor foreshadows fragility. Solomon's later years, compromised by foreign marriages and the toleration of foreign cults, reveal how easily political alliances invite religious syncretism. The temple's magnificence cannot, by itself, secure a faithful heart. Prosperity and artifice do not guarantee fidelity. With Solomon's decline, the old tensions, economic strain, social grievances, the struggle for power, come to a head. Rehoboam's failure to temper harsh policies stokes rebellion. Jeroboam takes a northern crown and seeks to secure a fragile polity by creating rival sanctuaries. His choices, erecting golden calves in Bethel and Dan, are pragmatic attempts to anchor loyalty, but they become theological catastrophes. What began as political expedience becomes institutionalized idolatry. Worship is retooled into a political instrument, and the form of devotion survives while its substance is eroded. Thus is born the divided kingdom, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, a political partition that mirrors a spiritual rupture. The divided kingdom is the narrative's apex of consequence. It shows how personal choices radiate outward into national structures. The north, Israel, adopts alternate shrines and practices that distance the people from the shape of the covenant. The south, Judah, clings to Davidic lineage and the temple, but also stumbles into its own compromises. Into this fractured landscape, the prophets step as an ethical and theological conscience. They speak with urgency and tenderness, warning of the costs of continued deviation and yet holding out the possibility of return. They declare judgment, but also trace hope. visions of a restoration that will not merely rebuild walls, but heal hearts. The prophetic word insists that the promises to Abraham and David are not cancelled by human failure. Rather, they are promised seeds that will germinate in ways that surpass immediate political horizons. In the northern kingdom, patterns of idolatry and injustice draw prophetic condemnation and political decline. Assyrian pressure, prophetic warnings, and internal corruption create a trajectory that tragically leads to exile and scattering. The southern kingdom fumbles through cycles of reform and relapse. At times kings arise who seek genuine return, Hezekiah and Josiah among them. But these renewals, while profound, face overwhelming geopolitical tides. Exile comes as the unthinkable outcome of accumulated infidelity. The people are led away from the land the promise named, and the temple's quiet is broken. Yet even exile is not simply an endpoint. It is, within the story's theological imagination, a refining crucible. The prophets in exile and in the land articulate a vision of restoration that is not a mere reconstituting of the old order, but a hope for renewal that reorients community around faithfulness and mercy. They speak of a future where a new heart and a new spirit will be given, terms that the tradition reads as foreshadowing deeper reconciliation. The promise to Abraham and the vow to David persist as threads beneath judgment, pointing toward a future in which covenant fidelity is finally realized. In that forward-looking imagination, the divided kingdom stands as both warning and prologue. It reveals what human choices can produce, and it points to the necessity of a restoration that remakes hearts, not just borders. Through all this, the motif of Abraham's legacy remains present and insistent. The promise, land, descendants, and blessing shows how a single call can generate a people, and how that people's history will be shaped both by God's faithfulness and human frailty. The covenant is not a magic talisman. It is a relationship shaped by obedience, repentance, and mercy. The narrative insists that God's purposes move through flawed carriers. Promises are kept not because people are perfect, but because God is patient, persistent, and merciful. Consider the way providence threads through catastrophe and triumph alike. Joseph's humiliation becomes the scaffold for survival. Moses' hesitation becomes the stage for deliverance. David's sin becomes the soil for repentant poetry. Time and again the story turns human failure into the place where divine fidelity is displayed. Yet the text never turns failures into mere instruments without cost. Reckoning follows sin. Judgment is real. Consequences are lived. The divided kingdom is the most public of those consequences. When leadership turns pragmatism into theological compromise, entire communities are reshaped. What then can be learned from this long sweep? First, the divine promise does not erase human responsibility. The covenant framework carries weight precisely because it demands a response, an ethical, communal, worshipful response. Second, that leadership matters enormously. The moral formation of a people is inseparable from the character of those who lead. Third, that hope persists even in judgment. Prophets bring both the hard words of correction and the softer words of future restoration. Their voice is, in many ways, the hinge by which the narrative swings from exile back to expectation. The divided kingdom, as climax and consequence, forces a sober reflection. It dramatizes how the allure of security, prestige, and political consolidation can erode the spiritual core of a people. Jeroboam's calves are more than crude figures. They symbolize a substitutionary logic that says form can substitute for faith. In contrast, Abraham's legacy insists on substance over imitation, a promise secured by relationship, lived out in obedience and trust. The tension between form and faith, between idols that comfort and a covenant that challenges, is the kingdom's central drama. Yet the story resists despair. Even as kings fail and nations fracture, the promise of restoration endures. Prophetic voices, sometimes scathing, sometimes tender, insist that the story does not end with exile. They speak of a shepherd who will gather the scattered, of a branch that will grow from David's stump, of a renewed covenant written not on stone, but on hearts. These images foreshadow a hope that, in the tradition, is read as pointing toward a fulfillment that reshapes the entire arc. The legacy of Abraham thus functions on two levels. It is historic, real descendants, a real land, rituals and rites that shape communal life. It is also theological, a pattern of promise, testing, failure, and mercy that teaches about God's character and human vocation. The divided kingdom shows what happens when the historic and theological drift apart, when political forms are allowed to substitute for covenantal depth. The prophet's insistence that God will restore suggests that the deepest longing of the story is not for mere return, but for transformation, a people reconstituted in fidelity. As the centuries turn, and the exiles tell their tales beside foreign rivers, they do not lose the melody that began at Ur's edge. They sing of promise and pleading. They remember the ram provided at the last moment, the ladder that linked heaven and earth, the child who dreamt himself into power, and the shepherd who repented at a prophet's scorn. In memory and in lament, they hold on to what was given, even as they confess what was lost. In that confession, the prophetic imagination finds its power. It does not merely recount failure, it imagines a healed future. So the untold history spoken of in our title is not merely a catalogue of events. It is an interpretative arc, a moral commentary written across generations. Abraham's legacy travels like a thread, narrow, persistent, tensile, through the fabric of Israel's story. The divided kingdom, painful as it is, becomes an emblem of the cost of forsaking covenant for expediency. And yet, paradoxically, the very consequence of division becomes part of the story that yields restoration. Through exile and return, the necessity of inner conversion becomes clearer. What remains, for readers and hearers, is a question both ancient and pressing. How are promises honored in a world of shifting powers and fragile hearts? The Israelite saga does not deliver a simple rule, but it does offer patterns. Trust is formative. Leaders shape souls, mercy meets failure, and the hope of renewal is never extinguished. These are not merely historical curiosities, they are theological and ethical prompts that invite reflection. In the sweep from Abraham's road to the fracture of a kingdom, there is a persistent invitation, not to nostalgia for lost political forms, but to a recovery of fidelity. The story calls communities to remember that stability built on expedience will crack, that religious forms without covenantal depth are hollow, and that divine promises, while not guaranteed by human perfection, are steadfast because of God's covenantal commitment. Thus the tale closes where it began, with a promise uttered on a journey, and with the knowledge that promises demand response. Abraham's legacy radiates through the ages, sometimes kept in fragile fidelity, sometimes tarnished by human failing, but always pressing forward toward a restoration that will, in the prophetic imagination, renew both land and heart. The divided kingdom remains the narrative's stern lesson and its hopeful turning point, proof that human choices can divide nations, but also that the divine commitment can, through pain and prophecy, reweave what was torn. If this journey has stirred your curiosity about the deeper threads of these ancient tales, there are more legends and prophetic visions to explore. Like, subscribe, and watch our playlist on prophets and the messianic hope to continue tracing how these promises unfold across the centuries.